Hello and welcome to UX Leadership by Design, the podcast by and for UX design leaders. I'm Mark Baldino, your host. This podcast is and always will be brought to you by Fuzzy Math, the user experience design consultancy that brings consumer-grade UX to the enterprise. Fuzzy Math provides digital product strategy, UI design, and UX design operations to life. I'm also a founder, so I'm a bit biased. Today we are lucky enough to be talking to Parisa Bazl, the head of user experience at Commvault, an enterprise data protection and data management software company. Today's conversation is a gem. Spoiler alert. If you are a design leader and you're struggling to grow your design team while staying within budgets or working under hiring freezes, please listen. Much of her work is focused on scaling the impact of a UX team within an organization while also opening up opportunities for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the design world. Her solution combines system-level thinking and frameworks, what she refers to as an object-oriented design approach, with a training program that is bringing folks with non-traditional backgrounds into the design world. It is impressive to say the least. So I'm very excited for the conversation, and let's go. Welcome, Parisa, and thanks for joining me on the UX Leadership Podcast. How are you today?
Thanks. I'm doing well. Thank you. How's it going with you?
I'm doing well. I was just saying you're based in New York City, and I was out there this past weekend for sort of it's a idealized fall weekend. So it was really, really nice to be out in New York City again.
Yeah, it's always great when the weather makes it nice. It's like one rainy day and you're like, what am I doing here? But
Yeah, I have some clients coming up to Chicago in a month, and it's like we were originally supposed to do it over the summer. Schedules didn't work, and I just said we were really rolling the dice with an early November, Thursday, Friday in Chicago. But it'll be good to have them in person and see them in person. I've been working with them for a year, and I haven't yet. And I'd love to get to that maybe shift in how remote work has changed over time, but.
yeah.
We're wondering if you can give kind of a quick background on how you got into UX, what that journey was, and then what was the time you were either ready to, or maybe someone said, hey, you're ready to kind of shift into a leadership role from, going from UX practitioner to a UX lead.
Yeah, totally. So I think like a lot of people in the field, I had a very roundabout way of finding my way into UX. When I was in undergraduate school, I studied medieval and early modern literature. So I did a
Okay.
lot of Dante, Shakespeare, Chaucer, and I was graduating and I was kind of freaking out because I wasn't sure what I was going to do with that. I didn't want to stay in academia. And I knew I wanted to live in New York City, actually. And so just kind of being the child of immigrants, like I needed like a little bit of a safety net. So I went to grad school at Pratt Institute, and initially, I focused on library science. So that was kind of like, I thought maybe I'll work in a museum or an archive. And library science is all about how do you store and retrieve information in a physical setting. And I did a semester of that and I absolutely hated it. And so before I totally, dropped out and, just regrouped, I was like, there was a couple of classes in the sister track on information science, which was how do you store and retrieve information digitally. And right around that time, I ended up really liking those classes. And right around the time when I was graduating, UX, while it had been around, I think it was sort of a newly defined field. It was definitely getting a little buzzwordy. And so my timing actually worked out really well. And I graduated from Pratt with a degree in information science. I'd had some portfolio work from school. And then I just started, hawking my wares out on the streets of New York. And I landed like small job at a startup, but not too long later, I found my way into enterprise software. And I think I got a majority of my sort of early career training at a company called Infor, which was business software. So I've sort of specialized in enterprise software since then.
And then you're currently the head of UX at Commvault.
Yes, currently at Commvault Systems. So we do data backup and protection, another enterprise company. Basically, we help people like say, I have all this data over here. I want to make copies of it in case of a ransomware attack or, regulations or anything like that. Um, and it's been a really great journey. I think I was sort of the first person, I was really kind of tasked with integrating UX and design as a core discipline at a historically very engineering led organization. So that was appealing to me when the challenge came along because at Infor, it being a merger and acquisition based company, I was sort of first confronted with these challenges of, scale, of trust building. Recently acquired companies, there's definitely a lot of mistrust. A portfolio of over 200 products and a small design team, you have to figure out, how do we scale best practices across industries, across products. So I did a lot of learning in those 5 years I was there, and I had a small break after that. But when Commvault came along, I was kind of consulting, and when Commvault came along, I was like, oh, this seems like sort of some ripe ground to test out a lot of design theories around, scale and just integrating it as a discipline, like I said.
What was that pivot from I I'm a practitioner of design, applying that skill to either I want to be a UX lead, I want to grow a team. Was that a shift in companies or within one? And was that something you realized you wanted to do?
Well, I actually I went from a designer up to senior management when I was at Infor.
Okay.
And I'm not so keen on management. I don't actually believe that people really need to be managed. I think people
Right.
need to have some understanding of strategy and why they're being asked to do things, and also feel empowered to inform it. For me, management is a necessity by way of like, uh, if you want to sort of lead in terms of vision and strategy, which have always been the things that have appealed to me, is like, I see design as sort of a fundamental business practice, and there's sort of an emphasis on business there. So, how do you fold it into a broader product development strategy in a way that makes it appealing, not just from like the quantitative numbers, but also just kind of as a compelling place to work for the talent that you want? So at Infor, as the positions opened up, I was either referred to them or applied for them, and so it sort of was a organic evolution, I would say there. And then having learned as much as I did and ending at the title that I did there, um, Commvault came along, and it was, as I said, kind of like a means to implement a design framework.
Okay.
And I think that, frameworks of scale and efficiency are ultimately what appealed to me. And having a clear vision of that, it sort of lends itself to leadership roles.
Yeah. If I go back to that comment you made about you don't, I don't want to misquote you, but you don't fundamentally believe people need to be managed. When I think of
Hmm.
bigger enterprise companies, like, did you run into resistance? Did you work around that? Did you just avoid like traditional people management, like responsibilities, and somebody else handles that? Like,
Yeah.
it would from the outset seem like it wouldn't quite work in a big enterprise organization.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there's things we like more about our jobs and things we like less. I don't, like I would say that, having to fill in like these, HR things around like tracking, objectives and stuff like that. I prefer for it to be organic discussion based conversations that I have with team members, and for us to be working together as a unit. So that's more of what I mean is like, I really believe that people have all of, the means and the willingness to bring as much value as they can to an organization. It's not necessarily an all consuming, like my job is my life thing, but I think for the most part, like, I want to make sure that people enjoy their work, because I think if you enjoy your work, then you're going to bring your best foot forward. So it's more about creating the environment for that. With management, it's kind of like, I guess I'm thinking of the word very, strictly. Like, I don't think like you need to manage people. I think if somebody comes in junior and they want to grow and they want to learn, then you need to think about where can I give them these learning opportunities and things like that. But I don't know that I believe in sort of like staying on top of people for these small things, but it's more like, how do we set up a framework for the organization that, sets up all different people of all different levels for success, so that some of the things that you sort of traditionally think you have to manage actually sort of just get resolved in the mechanisms of, of just kind of like your team operating within the constraints that you've set.
Right. Was it the role at Commvault or how Commvault structures things that you felt like this is a good fit for frameworks, and I'd love to dive into, how you define frameworks, whether we're talking about, people frameworks, career maps and ladders for your team, or design, operations frameworks and design systems. Do you, and maybe ancillary to that is, does that feel like it fits more in this like enterprise B2B space than maybe in the consumer facing space?
Enterprise versus consumer, I think that there's somewhat less debate, I guess, in some ways. Like, I think that with enterprise, sometimes the constraints that you're operating in lend themselves to creativity a little bit more. Like, you know that this is ultimately what the product is offering. You know that there are some core things that people have to do every day, or like have to use the product for. So I think that research, while there are some challenges in the decentralization of it and the fact that like you have product managers who are like very much experts in, the day-to-day tasks of people who are Kubernetes admins, for example, like that there's sort of those different inputs that you kind of have to figure out how to manage a little bit. Like you can't really operate in this full like beautiful end to end, oh, research all the way to design cycle, right? Um, so I think that enterprise kind of lends itself a little bit more to like setting up um, specific sorts of design methodologies, like in order to enable um, this collective goal of rapid delivery. Like we have to, in some ways, position ourselves as a service provider to developers and product managers. And that's not to say that we don't make calls on like best practices or like what constitutes a good design versus not. But I think that a huge chunk of the day-to-day things that the team has to do um, are more, they're not as heavily reliant on like full research and understanding. Like we sort of do those outside of a product development cycle. How are people troubleshooting things? Like what are the different like things that they look for in order to discover where an error is, right? It's not tied to a specific feature or delivery within our cycle. And there are certain things that we know a lot about, we have a lot of internal expertise around, and we just sort of have to figure out what's the proper design for that. Um, so setting up efficiencies of scale in that aspect of the organization, I think, is sort of where we've had a lot of success.
That's great. So, maybe some basics. How big is your team? You mentioned sort of acting as a service to,
Hmm.
maybe product, but also sort of development engineering. Like, what's the size of the team? Where is it within the organization? And you alluded to how you serve the team, but is it like a shared service, or do you have versus maybe a deeply embedded, less horizontal organization? What's the setup?
Yeah, so right now, so I've been at Commvault for almost 4 years. I spent the first year heavily observing kind of like how everything was operating, learning the product, that sort of thing, and figuring out, forging the right relationships and figuring out how do I really set this team up for success. There'd been a few designers here prior to me beginning. They were reporting into different development teams, so there wasn't a centralized practice. So um, we have since scaled to a total of 11 headcount. Some are developers. We have a person who coordinates a lot with our front end team. She has a lot of CSS expertise, JavaScript, et cetera. And so she's been working on the internal tooling around our component library and things like that. And then we have designers that are sort of engaging on, we're building this specific feature or building out this aspect of the product. And so we have designers engaging in that way. And the teams, my intention always as a leader is to set up the team as a triangle. Again, just going back to the idea of this being a business practice as well, is like you want to pay people the right amount, but you want to pay the right amount of people, right? And so we have three like fairly senior level designers um, who effectively manage other people as well. They do build out screens too, like especially for the more complex projects, like building out prototypes and things like that. But we had this need really, as I was saying before, about like sort of servicing these other departments. And we really needed to figure out, how can we generate high fidelity prototypes like as rapidly as possible? Because what I've found is that within the product development cycle, when you've got developers and you've got product managers and even test people coming in, sometimes salespeople, it's like this idea of requirements. It's a very kind of like abstract idea, like people write out requirements. Different people, I would wager a bet that everyone listening to this podcast has like probably gotten different variations of requirements
Yeah.
even within the same org or from the same person.
Yeah.
So, right. Like, so, and when you write stuff down, it's also, you still leave a lot of room for interpretation. Like the user has to be able to initiate a configuration. Well, one person might put a button somewhere, like one person, you know what I mean? Like it just can be visualized very differently. And with developers, I draw the analogy between like real estate and software. Like it's not an accident that we share a lot of the same terminology, and there is no real estate developer that will agree to build a building if they do not see the architectural design of that building first. And it's the same thing with our software developers. Is like, especially at Commvault, is like they want to see it in order to really understand. Obviously there's some back end work they can do in the meantime, but in general, even seeing like a specific label of a form field, they know, oh, I'm going to have to make an API call, or I'm going to have to make a back end commit after this step in the wizard, right? So I share this goal of wanting to deliver as many well-designed features as possible within a certain release, as the product managers do, as the developers do. And one of the ways that we can enable that is to figure out how do we sort of infuse our best practices into our design system so that we can generate these prototypes as rapidly as possible. So when I was scaling the team, the need really was less in the senior design area and more in like kind of the manpower, woman power, person power of, creating these prototypes as rapidly as possible. So you're naturally looking for more junior people.
Now, do you feel that the creation of UI, as you said, sort of as quickly as possible, we need to demonstrate what this looks like
Mm-hmm.
for maybe senior level buy-in, but you mentioned specifically like the people that are responsible for implementing this, because that's going to kind of sell them on the idea. I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people try to position the earlier part of the user-centered or human-centered design process around the research and strategy and see themselves as product strategists first and kind of UI designers second. Is that
Mm-hmm.
something that it's just that your senior folks are able to handle, or do you de-emphasize that and really, put your foot on the pedal towards let's generate as much high quality, high fidelity UI as we can as a group? And I don't want to overstate either side, but I'm kind of curious that
Yeah.
balance between the research and product strategy and UI and design systems.
Yeah, we definitely don't diminish that. I mean, but before we do any kind of prototyping, at the very least, we need architectural documentation. So it's kind of like mandatory, I guess, in some cases, like always start with your user flows, um, and some sort of like data structure mapping. So we always start there. It's also just a really good anchor for the initial cross functional conversation as well, because if there's technical dependencies or something like that, it's a visual asset that, the different disciplines can also refer to and comment on. We do our research, like, there's a lot of secondhand research that necessarily I think has to happen in enterprise, especially when you look at a company like Commvault, where like we have resellers as well. So it's, sometimes we're like 3 or 4 degrees away from our end user. And just to coordinate a feedback loop within a specific project cycle can be very challenging. One of the benefits of Commvault is that we do use our own software. So we have a lot of internal people that we can refer to, and we ask them to kind of like show us how they move through the application. Salespeople as well. I think in terms of how people demo products, that's also very telling, because there's a dedication to the end user as well as the business, and the people who buy the software are oftentimes different from the people who use it. So we also want to make sure that we're accommodating for those, that type of user, that buyer as well. So, and we have product managers and support people that are also kind of talking to us about what are the issues that they see in this particular area of the product. Like, the types of challenges or tickets that are coming in from our users. So I guess I mean to say is that our research it's not such like this clean, pretty bow that I think a lot of the discipline of UX sells itself on, like, oh, you do research and then you have all your findings and then you build your map. Like it's just in practice, it's a little bit messier than that. I think the sooner that you have any kind of visual asset, and again, we don't dive right into prototyping, we always start with some sort of architectural asset, but the sooner that you have that, the easier the conversations become to facilitate as well. So I think, more than anything, like we're trying to aid the conversation to completion so that we can all agree on like this is what we're going to build.
Right. And that's the sort of the end purpose of what you and your team are doing. We're trying to visualize what we're going to build. We're trying to get internal and maybe through, as you said, sort of sales and support, like external validation, that what we're doing is kind of moving the needle forward on the usability and user experience of the product. You
Mm-hmm.
alluded to, we've talked about systems, and you've talked about where your need was from a resource perspective. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people that I talk to, will admit it is hard to find
Mm-hmm.
UX talent these days. It's very, very kind of competitive market. I loved your quote about, you need to not just pay people the right amount, but how did you say? You pay the right, Misty, you said
Pay,
pay the right amount of
yeah,
people? Yeah.
pay
That,
people the right amount, but pay the right amount of people.
yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's great. I mean, what challenges did you run into scaling? I think you've started to build out a pretty unique program to help with that scale, which sort of fits into your model of let's be UI forward and kind of framework first.
Yeah, so the challenges I've run into resource scaling, I mean, like my first year at Commvault was 2019, so the second year was 2020, right? So everybody was cutting budgets everywhere. I think that we've had frozen headcount on and off, since then. Another sort of passion of mine is like DE&I within this field as well. Like I have had I could, like, give you a couple of attributes about all my managers and, like, you know what I mean? Like, and it's like I've had, like, 7 different managers in the course of my career, and, like, you can describe like, they share a lot of similarities, I'll put it that way, like, in terms of demographic. And so I have thought a lot about, like, how do you and as somebody who is hiring, like, how do you also sort of, like, invest in a more diverse pipeline? So I don't think that those things are like mutually exclusive. And I've kind of always wanted to figure out like how do I scale my team in a cost effective way? How do I also like sort of diversify the field, open up opportunities and things like that. So because our design methodology at Commvault, I call it object oriented design. And so that's what kind of anchors our design system. So basically, like when we have a use case come in, we look at it along 3 dimensions. Like, what is the object, the data object? What are the attributes of that object that the user needs to define or see or whatever it is? Um, but what's the user doing to that object? Are they creating it? Are they retrieving it? Are they updating it? Or are they deleting it? And oftentimes projects contain all of those things, but you think about your flows initially, like from that standpoint. And then is this the main object? Like, are we creating a plan within another, broader object? Like, is it an object set, a detail, or a child? So we sort of have this like framework by which we can interpret the use cases. Whether or not the use cases are valid, of course, is that deeper question along research and coordinating with product managers and things like that. But once you have the use case, you can kind of feed it through this analysis and it informs the way in which our components arrange themselves into patterns. And that's really how we catalog our patterns. I have a long article about this. I can also we can attach this podcast if people want to read more about it. Um, but what it did was it made, our sort of like logical framework for our design decisions very explicit. And so then we had this thought, well, that means that it's going to be really effective for us to onboard people, right? Like in terms of understanding, oh, this is a pattern, like this is your use case, we have a similar use case, like this is the pattern for addressing it. And what we ended up doing earlier this year was we found a nonprofit to partner with. And so this nonprofit is called Opportunities for a Better Tomorrow. And I came to the chief people officer at our company with this idea. There's a lot of support around Commvault, and they do a good job of living their values. But I said, listen, like, this is the business need that we have. I have a very small team, especially in proportion to the engineers and the product managers. And in the instances where we have really been able to upfront the design work to just sort of meet with the PM more immediately, rather than them writing out a whole Word document, we're working on flows with them. We're sort of showing the architecture to developers. Like, we have been able to deliver really key features, like all the way through to test and deployment within 3 months. And that's factoring in development dependencies. I mean, if you're just looking at the time it takes to unblock devs so that they can actually begin, obviously it's like much shorter. And whether or not they start is, not as much my problem. But like, so we sort of made the business case for it. So this is the need, right? Like, I need to scale in this area. I have senior level people. I can put them on a lot more projects if they're not doing the production work. And rather than say, okay, in the New Jersey area or the New York area, you're looking at starting salaries like between what I mean, like 70 to 100,000 sometimes, like for your more mid-level people. Like, rather than say I need headcount in that way, what we did was, like, we have a very, we believe that we can enable people very rapidly. And I found a nonprofit called Opportunities for a Better Tomorrow. And Opportunities for a Better Tomorrow, they provide training to at-risk youth. So typically between the ages of like 18 and 24, they have non-traditional educational backgrounds. They meet a certain socioeconomic requirement. And OBT, what they do is they offer training in two ways. They have a marketing program, and then they also have an AWS cloud practitioner program. So neither of these are design programs, and the students didn't have any design training. But the good thing about the AWS certification is, at the very least, they have a fundamental understanding of like computer and softwares, and especially in Commvault's case, they understand what Commvault as a company does. We worked with OBT to recruit some students from their cohort, and the great thing was that OBT gets funding from New York City to pay for an internship, in quotes. And so what we did, they said, okay, we'll pay 4 students 175 hours. And we said, we'll take that 175 hours and we will train those students in this time. So they'll get a UX internship. So we worked through a curriculum, not only just introduction to the company and the product, but also back end, front end. Again, they had a bit of a fundamental understanding of that, but sort of like, what is UX and like, why do we think about it? Like, why is it important? As well as just very practical skills around Figma. And we also introduced this object oriented framework so that they could start to see, like, okay, like, this is how I interpret my projects. Here's how I like use components and arrange them in a certain way in order to meet that requirement. And so we did that training over the course of 175 hours. By the end of it, they were actually working on projects. And then the agreement was
Project for you, like
yeah,
project.
yeah,
Awesome. Okay.
yeah. And then the agreement was, if they had sort of been able to learn all the necessary skills and stuff, Commvault would then offer them a 6-month, $20 an hour full-time contract. So they've been working with us full-time now for about 2 months, and our output has increased exponentially. Like, we've had some projects completed, in terms of unblocking development within like 5 to 7 days, sometimes shorter. Because again, like, the biggest thing is people need a visual aid to anchor the discussion, to sort of make sure we're all agreeing when we say we're building this feature, to say, like, quite literally, like, this is, the feature and this is how it's going to be built, as opposed to some kind of like abstract esoteric description of it or whatever. So that's been really effective for us, right? Is like, we've really been meeting some key business needs like very rapidly. And it's cost effective for us. Obviously, we do want to bring on these folks full time at some point. There's macroeconomic factors at play, but the good news too is that if these students, they're building up a portfolio, right? And so if there are other opportunities elsewhere, or there's other industries that they're interested in, we know that it's not high risk for us to have resource attrition, because we already have like a operating model that we know for sure it'll only take us 175 hours to onboard somebody, on someone else's dime, no less,
Right.
right?
Right.
So we kind of do all of like that's another great thing about it is that you're really like vetting the resource as well, in a very low risk way to your organization. We've dedicated the training time, but truly that was not problematic if you kind of time it right within a release cycle as well, like when things
Right.
are more going into tests and stuff, you know.
Right. So you're meeting
So
the you're meeting the business need, you're working within budgetary constraints. There's like this, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion, sort of, I would say like an
mhm,
altruistic approach. Like it sounds pretty incredible. I do want to commend you on the program because I think a lot of people
thanks.
might hear this and say, wow, that seems like a ton of work, and I'm sure it is a ton of work. You're kind of describing it as though it all worked out perfectly, which sounds like it is, but I'm sure there were some challenges and struggles along the way. But I just want to applaud you because I think a lot of people head in the opposite direction in terms of how they want to grow and build their teams. And I think you said you're doing it in kind of a risk averse way, right? Like it's budget friendly and it's helping folks who have untraditional backgrounds get into the design field. I think sometimes see that people who lead design teams see that as a risk, right? They're not getting the top of the market, and that's what they want to fight for because that introduces an expert on their team. That's I don't want to say that is a little less risky, but your comment about you know attrition rates is equally as valid, which is you have a low cost way to onboard somebody onto your team that doesn't put your delivery at risk. Like I think it's a pretty amazing balance. Were there any points where you felt like,
Thanks.
oh, this isn't working, we got to rework something, like and it could, you can tell me it was really smooth from start to finish, I'll fully believe you, but kind of curious for folks that are thinking like, hey, I don't have a ton of headcount, but I might have some time to devote to this to start that pipeline. Any challenges? And then how long did it take from like you think having this idea to the time you onboarded those folks 2 months ago?
First of all, thank you. Yeah, I'm really proud of it. We're really proud of it as an organization. There was definitely um, it hinges on the design methodology because it's the object-oriented approach to design that makes this very effective. The analogy I always draw is like I think of design as a form of literacy. It's a visual literacy, right? And if you're to draw the analogy between that and written literacy, like if you are given a task where somebody says to you, okay, Mark, there's a ton of people in this world who don't know how to read and write. So what are you going to do? Like you have carte blanche. You can do anything you want in order to make as many people literate within the shortest amount of time. You don't like your biggest leverage point is not in opening up a ton of schools or training like or getting a ton of instructors. The biggest leverage point is you change the way that you spell because it's confusing, right? Like we have so many different symbol combinations for the same sound. The letter C makes one sound if it's followed by an R. It also sometimes makes that same sound when it's followed by a K. It makes a totally different sound if it's followed by an H or an E, right? So if you develop like more of a one-to-one relationship between your symbols and the sounds that they make, then you make it that much easier for people to learn how to read and write. And it's the same thing with design. I've seen multiple iterations of a sales order. A sales order is a sales order, right? Like there's best practices around these things. And it's not an accident when you log on to any e-commerce site that they share a lot of similarities because once something works, it's not to say that we can't innovate on things. It's just like with transportation, it's not really been in the shape of the car so much as it is in the engine. You know what I mean? Like it's just you have to sort of figure out what are you going to focus your resources on. So the biggest thing in terms of the actual time frame for this was the training and object oriented methodology for my senior people. For us, like, the time frame in terms of actually initiating, like having the idea for the project and stuff, I would say I probably came into Commvault mulling on these couple of different concepts, scale, DE and I, that kind of stuff. But in terms of manifesting the project, we started having conversations with leadership in, I want to say in like December to get like kind of approval. We got the initial budget approval actually coming out of our DE and I budget, which again, if you're to take a business look at this, is also very effective for a company because like you're looking at tax credits and things like that too. Like it's. it's an easier sell, I think, like for the initial iteration. We recruited the students. They came out of a June cohort. So we trained them over the course. It was like 5-hour days. And they ended their training August 12th. They started with us full time August 15th. And we definitely had, I felt really confident about this, like, going into it. The other really great thing is that it gives career pathways for senior level people, like, that you wanna keep at your company who want management experience. And it's like, okay, well, headcount's frozen in America, so we're not gonna be high, like, I don't want those people to leave, right? So it gives them career pathways as well. It's like, it's really, like, kind of multidimensional in its benefits. And honestly, I think, like, because of sort of the regular way in which we did check-ins and also the way we were mandated to do check-ins because the money was coming from the city, like, we sort of had a continual gauge on, people's performance and how they were doing and stuff like that. So, if any concern was brought up by the senior designer who was doing the training, it was kind of easier to troubleshoot. I think the biggest risk is that you have to time it with your other project work so that
Okay.
you're not down like that senior head count,
Yeah.
within that sort of couple of months.
Fantastic. Are
Mhm.
you exploring another cohort? And did you only you brought two people through, and both of
We
those
were at 4.
four through?
Yeah,
And did all four
yeah.
of those take like the contract position with you folks?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Awesome.
it's been great, yeah, it really has. They've been awesome, and it's all local economy too, which is great. Like, it's a really big thing with Commvault in terms of living their values, and it's nice, to not have to outsource things and juggle time zones. Like, our quality of work can kind of stay at a certain level. So, we have had discussions, at a high level about, whether or not full-time stuff will open up and just kind of looking at a time frame on that. I think that we would like to expand this program. There's a couple of other organizations that we're also looking at where they can fund, shorter internship programs, but maybe we can bring those students back like over the course of the summer and things like that. So I think it could really work with any kind of nonprofit. I think it's super helpful that these kids came from OBT in terms of the technical understandings. I do think all of that's teachable. And I think it's really more about, is this an organization that provides them with the professional skills, like sort of just like general, like work life management skills, as well as having a resource for, I mean, like, you're looking at folks who, like, it's a learning curve for them to know that you can, like, miss 2 hours of work from your 9 to 5 and make it up the next day, right? Like, so it's just like, it's things like that, like, something like just saying like, "Oh, you're sick one day and you can't make it," and, like, they have all of that support coming from OBT. So that stuff is really helpful to us, definitely.
Fantastic.
Mhm.
It is literally
Yeah,
fantastic. And
thanks.
the time frame to have folks, four folks joining your team, I think it is accelerated as well. Now you mentioned there's an article we can link to the object oriented design. Is there content around the apprentice program that you all are sharing if people wanted to learn more?
We're working on some content, so I guess if you wanna kind of follow me on LinkedIn, we'll be publishing more, think pieces and stuff like that about it. The, actual article I was referring to is published by Dscout on their People Nerds blog.
Great.
It's called "Diversify and Scale Your Team by Making UX Design More Accessible." So, kind of a lengthy title, but very descriptive.
All right. That's all right.
Um,
It is descriptive. It is descriptive.
yeah.
So that's great. Well, thanks for the invite for folks to follow you on LinkedIn. I think people will, I think, hopefully learn a good bit about the program you all set up at Commvault, and have grown. And because I think there's a lot of organizations that could benefit from the knowledge there. And I'll certainly link to your LinkedIn, and we'll link to the article you just mentioned on the DScout blog. But I just want to say thank you for what you're doing for designers in general and getting people with non-traditional backgrounds into design. And as somebody who's I think a systems thinker and a framework thinker, you're setting up a framework whether you intend or not for other people to follow. And I think that that's really, really impressive. But most of all, I want to say thank you for sharing your journey, what you're up to at Commvault, the program that you've built, your sort of thoughts around DEI and design. It's some great stuff, and I know the listeners will appreciate it. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. This was so fun, and I love talking about this stuff, so anytime, or anyone who wants to reach out and chat about it, by all means.
Well, it shows you have a genuine interest in what you're doing, and that definitely shows. So, Parisa, thank you very much for your time, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you.